told that that's in the past, and we just simply need to get over it. But it is time that we have open, honest, and truthful discussions, because the world is changing, and our colleges and universities must lead the way in informing the students we teach today, but also sharing our research and scholarship and knowledge with the larger community to help create a more humane world for all of us to exist. We also know that we have a responsibility to make our nation better, and there's no better source for doing so than through the transformative power of education. Our colleges and universities must take the lead and find the solutions together to advance our nation, and so that our nation can be more globally competitive, and that we can send our students out into the world to make it even better, because we started our work today. So at the end of the symposium, I know the working group will be looking at creating a plan of action to actually do the repair of the legacy of slavery. What that will look like, we don't know. But it is important that we begin that discussion and we look at opportunities for our colleges and universities, whether they're minority-serving institutions, historically black institutions, Hispanic-serving institutions, Native Americans, to all come to the table and work together so that we can create within our institutions really a model for the rest of the world to follow. I think that is charge for our institutions today as we educate the leaders of tomorrow. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for allowing all of us to be at the table and engage in this meaningful conversation. I look forward to seeing the recommendations from the working group.
Thank you. Historical sites with markers across our campus. Starting with the founding of the University of Mississippi in 1848, many of the most significant moments in the institution's history are tied to slavery, race, and segregation. Dr. David Sansing's History of the University, that was published in honor of the sesquicentennial of the university, wrote about this aspect and how it informed the very creation of the university. He wrote, as the sectional crisis deepened and the agitation over slavery intensified, Mississippians developed a siege mentality, formed a closed society, and concluded, those opposed to us in principle cannot be entrusted with the education of our sons and daughters. The founders of a state university understood that education is the process by which a culture transmits itself across generations. So fast forward now to 1962, when the Federal Appeals Court ordered the University of Mississippi to admit its first African-American student, James Meredith. Upon his arrival, a mob of more than 2,000 people rioted and 2 people were killed. And as recently as 2014, just 4 years ago, the university again made national headlines when 2 former students placed a noose and a flag containing the Confederate battle emblem on the statue that honors James Meredith on the Oxford campus. And there are numerous other examples throughout our history. While these incidents are not easy to discuss, we remain committed to honest and open dialogue about our distinct and difficult history on slavery, race, segregation. In fact, as an educational institution, we have a responsibility to teach and foster learning, especially from parts of our history that are painful. And to move forward, we must neither hide from nor hide the problems of our past. We have embraced that approach while at the same time making sustained, substantial, and measurable progress toward fostering a more diverse, a more inclusive campus. And today, nearly 24% of our students are people of color, including 1 out of every 8 UM students being African American. And the latest ranking showed our percentage of African American enrollment is the 2nd highest among SEC institutions. But there is much more to do, and we can do much better. In 2014, the university adopted an action plan, as it's called, which took an earnest and hard look to address race and related issues, including how to make our campuses more welcoming and inclusive. And Today I want to share with you some of those recent efforts that specifically address, and I'm going to quote, offering more history, putting the past into context, telling more of the story of Mississippi's struggles with slavery, secession, segregation, and their aftermath, close quote. And to do so, quote, without attempts to erase history, even some difficult history, end quote. The Confederate statue at the entrance of the Oxford campus was one of the very first physical sites to be contextualized. And the stated purpose at the statue, on the statue, was to honor fallen Confederate soldiers. But such monuments were often used around the turn of the last century, 2 centuries ago, to promote the lost cause ideology founded in white supremacy and aimed at the oppression of African Americans. After extensive review and input, an updated plaque explaining the statue's place in history was added to the site, and the plaque, in very honest and forthright language, explains that the monument reminds us, and I quote, that the defeat of the Confederacy actually meant freedom for millions of people. This historic statue is a reminder of the university's divisive past. Today, the University of Mississippi draws from that past a continuing commitment to open its hallowed halls to all who seek truth, knowledge, and wisdom. In addition to the statue, we undertook a concerted effort via a formal committee, the Chancellor's Advisory Committee on History and Context, to recommend and design physical sites across the entire Oxford campus that should be contextualized so as to explain the environment in which they were created or named. And in the final report from July 2017, the committee shared these eloquent words about their work, and I quote, contextualizing the campus reminds us of the enormity and complexity of our shared past. Done correctly and therefore carefully, contextualization is an additive process, not a subtractive one. The past merits scrutiny, even as it commands respect. Such an engagement with our collective past seeks to clarify, not to obscure. But while facing the past with humility, contextualization calls for honesty on behalf of all who will in the future develop their own relationships with the university. Contextualization, therefore, looks backward and forward simultaneously, working toward a just and faithful balance between humility and honesty. Those who undertake such work must be mindful of being stewards, transmitting an imperfect knowledge of the past to the imagined understanding of the future. As a result of this deliberate, thoughtful, and academically focused endeavor, this past spring we actually installed across our campuses 6 plaques recognizing 9 sites on campus. One of the plaques notes the contributions of enslaved laborers and includes the names of a number of slaves who performed work at the university. Additionally, the plaque for enslaved laborers includes the following candid language, and I quote, slavery was a system underpinned by exploitation and violence, and they also suffered beatings and other abuses documented in the university's records. The University of Mississippi today honors the legacy of these enslaved individuals and acknowledges the injustices under which they lived and labored. These plaques are daily reminders of our obligation to learn from the past and commit to an inclusive future. And today, I would also like to share an update with you of 2 additional projects related to our continuing work of contextualizing our campus. Dr. John Neff is leading our efforts on 2 projects regarding the intersections between the American Civil War and the university, the town of Oxford, and Lafayette County. These stories, previously untold on our campus, reveal the history of black men and white men, men who wore blue and gray. Research has presented a new understanding of the cemetery on our campus, as well as the hospital that once occupied the campus. A new archaeological survey will reveal a more definitive number of graves than previously known. Historical research has already expanded our understanding of who may lie buried on those grounds. What was once a list of about 130 names is now believed to be, that was believed to be interred, now has grown to more than 340, largely through painstaking examination of military service records. And the discovery of a hospital register stored in the National Archives in Washington will now give us new insight to the men who were cared for on our campus. We're also undertaking research into the lives of African American men of Lafayette County, enslaved men who left the land of their birth to join the Union Army as part of the USCT, the United States Colored Troops. To date, 17 names have been discovered, with another 26 believed also to have joined from the county. And the same painstaking research into their military service records will hopefully yield the stories of their lives and service, and eventually our intent is to memorialize those men on the campus. That's part of the plan that we announced in July of 2017. Both projects have much yet to accomplish, but we're encouraged by our progress to date. And we look forward to the day when we'll be able to tell the full history of our campus, town, and county with all the richness and diversity that characterizes our shared past. In addition to these efforts I've highlighted today, work continues naturally as part of the ongoing inquiry and study conducted at the university by faculty, staff, and students through our academic departments and schools, and in particular through the university's Slavery Research Group. And you're going to hear from many of our scholars over the next 2 days. We must continue to engage in profoundly important dialogue to more fully understand and articulate our historical truths so that we can learn from that past and chart a bold course forward for our university and for all whom we serve. In closing, I'd like to share an excerpt of the really powerful remarks given by Dr. John Neff at the ceremony at the unveiling of the plaques earlier this year on our campus. His stirring words get to the very heart of why work on this topic matters. And I'll quote, "We are the sum of all of our decisions, good and bad, all of those crossroads. We do not shrink from this, we embrace it. We do not shield our embarrassment, we offer it up. We do not deny any part of who we have been or who we are. We choose to face our past decisions with courage. We own them all, knowing that to do less is to diminish ourselves today and to hobble our future selves." Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Presbyterian Church in Tuscaloosa. And in 1875, he went to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church and asked if he could start a school to educate African American ministers. The importance of that is that in 1875, the Constitution of Alabama changed. And that ushered in Jim Crow, and the Constitution specifically said that they would no longer support education of the Negro. So there were no funding going to public education for previous slaves. I think the courage that it took for Dr. Stillman to go to that General Assembly of the Southern Church was very important, and something that we should all remember in terms of all the histories of our HBCUs. There are similar stories about white, courageous leaders who came out and saw the importance of educating slaves, because there were people that were prevented from reading and writing and learning. And for those folks to say, stand up and say, this is important, they're equal to us, we need to educate them, and we need to provide a way for them to educate others. If you weren't, at that time, we weren't allowed to go to the University of Mississippi and other schools in the 1800s. That didn't happen for many years later. We're talking about 1960s when you start seeing the James Merediths and others that were trying to attend these large public universities that our dollars also support it. And so when you think about equity and support, those are the types of issues and why I believe that HBCU should be integrally involved in this discussion, in this research, and certainly partnering with your institutions in terms of the study and also the support. You know, one of the things that I'm passionate about, as you can tell, is how important HBCUs are to the development. A lot of people question, well, what's the relevance of HBCUs today? Now blacks can go to the University of Mississippi and other major schools. And I will tell you that there are three things that we do that other institutions don't. Number one, we are the refuge for racism in this country, from young people to developing from adolescence into adulthood. There is no other place you can go where you won't be discriminated against because of your race, and that's any race, our culture, our background. And so that's so important for those developing years, and HBCUs provide that nurturing environment and that equitable environment where you're not mistreated. When you make an F, when you fail, it's because you didn't do the work. When the campus police stop you, it's not because you're black, it's because you were doing something wrong. So, you know, it is a place where you learn and you grow. The second thing that happens at our institutions is our students are developed leaders. They have opportunities to be the SGA president, the vice president, the secretary, every organization, even in their honor societies and their other disciplines. That leadership development that happens at our campuses is so critical to the development of those young people that attend most of your graduate schools. So we're developing leaders at our historically black colleges and universities. The third is the faculty and their commitment to excellence and to
I'm betting a lot of the money that funded the HBCUs will have deep roots in slavery. And so finding those kinds of connections. In terms of the attitudes, again, the president's panel, I think, brought out the attitudes toward HBCUs, somehow that they are substandard, but helping to correct that bit of miseducation and misunderstanding, I think, is part of what we can be, that the USS can assist with. And again, I think they had some really good ideas in terms of teaming up to figuring out a way to attract graduate students. Because of course PWIs talk a lot about needing to diversify programs, but how are you going to are you going to put your money where your mouth is, so to speak, and go to the source, which are HBCUs, if you really want to bring in a diverse student body. I know I spent a year last year at Swanee and the University of the South, and I know, for example, Woody Register there, who is the director of their slavery project, is there. Swanee is there. He's teaching a course that's moving between Swanee, Spelman, and Morehouse. So more of that. Swanee students have gone to Atlanta. Spelman and Morehouse students are going to be going to Swanee, and there are three faculty members that are working on this together. Next semester, I'm going to be teaching a class that's based at William and Mary, but that will be like synchronously, I'm still learning the language, but synchronously taught with a group of with students at Swanee. And so those kinds of things, because of the electronic world, the technology rather that we have access to, there are opportunities to do those things, I think, regularly between PWIs and HBCUs to bring them together, if not physically, certainly, through the technology. So those are just a few.
Let's talk a little bit about how USS institutions can work collectively to implement repair.
Well, I can start by saying I think, if this relates to getting your own house in order. I mean, I think at Georgetown, in addition to the work on slavery, memory, and reconciliation, we've also launched a number of broader racial justice initiatives. We have a health disparities initiative. We have a prisons and justice initiative where we're focusing on not only bringing education into the prisons for those who are currently incarcerated, but also helping returning citizens when they get out of prison to rebuild their lives. And those are examples of initiatives where we are working with other universities on mass incarceration, on health disparities, on health justice issues. So I think, if you broaden the lens a little bit to racial justice and racial injustice, which is a legacy of slavery and a legacy of segregation, that provides a useful way of looking at this as well, because then you have a broader lens at which you're looking at how universities might collaborate. And the roots of it are in slavery and in segregation and Jim Crow, but there are all these manifestations today, health disparities, economic disparities, mass incarceration, that I think open up lots of avenues for universities to collaborate. Part of the collaboration challenge, that I think we have to meet, but relates to what I was mentioning a moment ago. When you're looking at collaboration among universities studying slavery, you also have to recognize that each one of our institutions has its own unique context. We're in different places. Some universities are just beginning this work. Some have been at it longer. Some are somewhere in between. Where are they? And sort of, what time zone of the work are they in? Is there an engaged descendant community? What is the focus given the history of the institution's involvement in slavery? So I think those are things that also have to be factored into collaboration and finding common interests. I mean, that's just, I think we all know that. At the end of the day, the only things that are going to work is if you can find organic, authentic things that University X and University Y are already, they're interested in. You can't impose it. There has to be something organic and authentic there. And I think there is. But I think we have to find those things to activate the collaboration. I don't think we can just impose it by fiat and hope it happens. At least that's not in my experience.
I know sometimes maybe even just looking at your school's history, say with a neighboring HBCU. Because one of the things that we've come across is the 20th century attempt, but there was an attempt by some white students at William and Mary to interact with some of the black students at Hampton University. And it ended up not really working out because the administration was not supportive. But there is a history there, and one student from William and Mary did actually go to Hampton. So trying to find out, what is that story, what is that history, where else do we overlap that we don't necessarily know about? So there certainly, there is a place, an important place for starting with the archival research, because then you can find those true roots, and then maybe you can build on those roots over time.
Okay. On this session, we're going to allow some questions from the audience. So if you have a question, does anybody have a question now that's burning you to ask? I can't believe that nobody has a question. Okay, there you go. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much, panelists. I am Dr. Holly B. from the University of Cincinnati. And you'll have to forgive me because I am only a junior faculty member, although I'm up for tenure this semester. So from my perspective, and perhaps this is simply because I am a junior faculty member and I simply don't know how these things work, it seems to me that it is very difficult to convince the Board of Trustees, people who institute or suggest what curriculum should be. Why is it so difficult to convince them to do the work that should be done that we already can do? Yeah, for example, I'm teaching in the history department. I teach U.S. history. I also teach African American history. U.S. history courses are required in particular, they're required across the college, particularly within the College of Arts and Sciences. But something like African American history is an elective course, right? So if you're signed up for that class, you're there because it's an obligation as opposed to something that is required or the university perceives. This will lead to your intellectual development. This will make you a true, competent cultural citizen on this campus. Why is it so difficult to convince institutions that these courses should be across the board and not simply electives that are only applicable to students who are in the humanities? Why is this not important for students in the sciences? Why is this not important for students across the courses? How do we make people see this as vital?
I don't know that I have an answer to this, but I'm struck by, we've been wrestling with this at UVA, that the Slavery Commission, one of the right out of the gate was education. So we built programming, we built a curriculum, we run classes, and that's good, but it doesn't, you can't, I'm teaching a class with 60 students in it right now, there's a line out the door. I have back at the hotel 60 papers I have to grade because, right, it's not really in a department line, it's not funded. So we've been looking at what are the ways, right, this is where it has to come from the top. This doesn't answer your question because I'm mystified by why institutions sometimes just refuse to do what's really the easiest thing, right, which is just tell the story, talk about it, and you'd be amazed what happens next. But we're looking at why isn't this, right, it's a stealth initiative where you put these courses across the disciplines. So at UVA, we have this story about the development of a race science program in the 19th century that, among other things, involves grave robbing for anatomy and surgery and becomes a full-blown eugenics program in the 20th century. There's a medical education course, there's a biology course looking at it, right? It's housed, that program's housed in the biology department. So I'm struck by you can build these courses everywhere, and we wrestle with, and I think you will too, there's always a push, why isn't there one mandatory course that does it all? I don't think you can do it all in one course. Two, the very people who really need this education, they're the ones that are going to resent that the most. So you want to pull them in and not know that they've not really chosen the class, right? Like, you want to illusion of choice is important. And again, this differs from institution to institution, but I tend to joke with people about UVA, right? It's a cult, not a college. And we do a whole lot of navel gazing, and whenever we stare at our navels, Thomas Jefferson is waving at us. That's a problem, right? He's someone that needs to be moved out of the way to have these difficult conversations. So I really worry there's a push for a mandatory course, and I'm convinced it's going to be hijacked and become the UVA 101 course, and we're going to remember what all the great white people at UVA did back in the day. So I really think you have to think about how you build this around. We have a new general education curriculum that we're rolling out. Excuse me. That's where you start doing service. That might work too. But I think, and this is where I think this consortium is really important, right? The thing we were joking about this morning in the business meeting, right? What are your peer institutions and your aspirational peer institutions doing? And if you can show that to the administration, they tend to listen. And then the second piece, and you're already on this, is you have to frame it around a broader educational mission. They buy education. We've been able to move people out of the way repeatedly with this is part of the core educational mission. You're going to get really familiar with whatever the strategic planning, whatever, I think we have some, we call them pillars or something, right? If you can link it to those pillars and that ladder, it's really painful. But if you can do that, they tend to like.
You can get an education degree and never take an African American history class or women's or Native American. And so that was some of the gaps we were trying to fill in that 2 weeks for these teachers. And I agree, these classes need to be mandatory, or it needs to be mandatory that this content is put into your survey courses. And I know when I don't usually teach the surveys anymore, but when I did, I would always get 1 or 2 people on evaluations that would say she talks too much about black people. And then I found out I was not the only black professor who would get that, you know. And then one time I actually had a white student say, no, Professor Allen, it's just because you're black that they care about this, you know, that they're saying this. So anyway, I was like, drop the mic, I don't have to say anything anymore. But I do think it's important. I will share with you, William and Mary just finished kind of changing its general curriculum courses. And over the last couple of years, we had students actually were saying these classes, there needs to be a mandatory class that everybody has to take, where the classes are geared toward having these difficult conversations around race. Because if you don't, most people are not going to, the people who, as Kurt was saying, that need it the most aren't going to sign up for those classes. And so we now have a call or college 199 course that we're going to be offering. It's still being all ironed out, but it's been voted on and approved. And so if you, or anyone in here, you know, wants to hear more about it, you know, I'm happy to put you all in touch with, you know, with the people and to get, you know, to share with you what's already been being worked on. But, you know, again, it's an issue of process. And of course, you know, will a mandatory class work? Because, you know, you know, but you got to start somewhere. You got to start somewhere. And if you're not pulling in the people who really need it, you got to figure it out, you know. And so, you know, so we can talk afterwards. Also, just to share with you, I'm a junior faculty too. These are the big dogs.
And I would just say, you know, I think that we've done some work at Georgetown in terms of changing our core curriculum to get at that very question, and it has not been easy. But I would say, you know, to me, the root cause of the answer to your question is because dealing with the narratives of African American history, with Native American history, are challenging long-established narratives in our society. And I remember having a conversation. We do a lot of work. We're in Washington, D.C. We do a lot of work with the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And when that museum was opening, and talking with Lonnie Bunch, who's the director, and John Franklin and others, what they talked about was the museum. If you look at the National Mall in Washington, D.C., we've had competing narratives, right? We have the Museum of American History, which is a narrative of American exceptionalism. And we've had the National Air and Space Museum, which is a narrative of American technological power and prowess. The National Museum of African American History is opening up a new narrative and challenging that in a very dramatic way, sitting right there, you know, on the National Mall, in the shadow of the Washington Monument. And so I think there's this larger question of these narratives that simply have not been told and have been suppressed. And so when it gets down to the level of curriculum at our individual schools, that's how it manifests itself for us. Because you are now challenging the narratives that power has put in place and that have not been taught. And so I think it's a very challenging thing to deal with. But I wanted to just share that conversation with Lonnie Bunch about we're now telling a new narrative on the National Mall. And it will take time for that to, because that is the American narrative. It is the American narrative. And it's not easy for people to face that, I think, sometimes.
That's true. We're going to take another question here, but I want to come back to and ask the panel, ask a couple of questions. Two questions. What does systemic repair look like to you? And what would you like systemic repair to look like? Think about that. There's a question over here.
It's more of a comment, but it's to be part of the repair. And you can see the hesitancy in your response to the question. But the question to me is deep. What is not sexy is difficult to talk about. That's the underlying premise in the story of slavery. As an HBCU administrator and staff and faculty, we do have activities, not directly curriculum-based activity that will provide most of the in-depth information for us to understand, but we do have activities. I remember a few years ago when the story about Georgetown came in the news about the use of home slaves. That was a shock to a lot of people around the world. It was a big news. I had it on NPR. I was like, what's that about? But then the stories get to unfold, and then we begin to understand one of the greatest things that would come out as a compendium from this effort, which is the story of the slavery, could be how do you answer that question? How can we answer that question as educators? Because education is the transmission of culture and history through generations. If I can go through the curriculum and graduate and never have a history of my people, how do I inform, how do I mitigate, how do I lead, how do I guide people I'm supervising who are supervising me, how do I function in a system? So it's not that I have a question, it's just that the hesitancy I can see in the response, because there is no silver bullet we can point to, which I don't think would be even with it. But what it can give us is there's different ways to skin a cat. Nonetheless, the cat must be skinned.
That's right. Let me ask this question. Is there any hesitancy on the panel up here?
Not consciously, but it's one of the things that I did, that when she first asked the question, one of the first words that came to my mind is fear. There's a fear of turning off a part of your constituency. Mm-hmm. They're trying to get the campus tours to include the full history of the college. Like people will go running away screaming if they know that you once owned slaves. So there's that fear, I think, which I don't think is very realistic at all. I've asked students in particular if you had known or did you know William and Mary's history. And I've never had someone say I would not have come. Most have said, it makes me feel better about being at William and Mary. Because the truth is, if these administrations would acknowledge it, you're hard pressed, I think, to find an institution of higher learning in this country that is not in some way connected to slavery, the slave trade. Certainly, it's even if it's the money, even if they were founded or opened after the war, as say Swanee was, but the roots, the money roots, the financial roots are steeped in slavery. And so, but again, maybe getting college administrators to come to something like this, or to go into their individual offices and say, this institution is not the only institution that has this history. We're all making it public. You need to get on board, kind of thing. Now, you may have to be tenured to say that. But, I do, but no, there wasn't a conscious fear on my part. I guess hesitancy, but I do think at the bottom of it, it's fear. It's the, I know William and Mary just launched a a project to memorialize the enslaved, and we just closed the idea competition portion. And we worked on that for 4 years. There was such hesitancy about, again, well, will anybody give money to this? Well, what is this going to mean? I mean, it was all kinds of stuff, and we would think we were just about at the door, and then there would be another issue. So finally, it has happened, but a lot of it was fear. What is the reaction going to be? And if it's a negative reaction, what are the people, the big donors, are they going to, take their money back or, or whatever? But no real understanding of, you may start to get money from people who would never have given before because of this. So, but no understanding of the broader picture. This very risk-averse, I think, culture is you just have to keep, because one of the things that we did is that we would not give up. When they kept saying no, we kept going back with another report, another rationale, and so finally we just warmed down. Maybe, I don't know, but it's happening. But again, fear is a big issue, and money is at the root of that fear.
Joe and Kurt, any backlash from your campuses and from your faculty, your students, and your funders in respect to the openness of your association slate?
Yeah, no. I mean, I'm struck by, and this is very similar to the situation with Mary. Right? Our commission started in 2013, entirely driven by student and alumni energy. So we've had a wind pushing us from behind at most points. Is there resistance? Yes, right? We were an almost entirely white male institution into the 60s. They've not been public, but I joke, I get blowback on social media about it. It's always from Who's 68, right? So it's anonymous, but we know who you are. So no, not much, but it's that fear at the top level. When we started our memorial process, and this is something to think about, right? You need multiple allies. Your institution will gladly let you do all of this. I don't have tenure. I'm a dean. I have a 12-month position. I don't get paid for this. This isn't about me, but I want to say that I think this is really typical. It's finding allies and building a team, because if you're pressing on multiple fronts and you're doing this in a deliberate and transparent way that's, again, linked to, I think, people respond to what the institutions do. They see themselves as educators. If you can keep it linked to that, you'll get some traction. And on our memorial process, it was all conversations about, if we do this, are there going to be protests like there were at Georgetown? And we looked and we're like, if you don't do this, you're going to get the protests. And that moved, and we're now at a point, 4 years in, right, we're going to break ground in the next few months. And memorials are important only to a point. But at a place like UVA, I think we really rate this as that major change to the landscape that's necessary. I think every member of the Board of Visitors has made a significant financial contribution to the fundraising, and the board has committed to cover, when you do these projects, as soon as they break ground, the fundraising gets much more difficult. And the board has committed to picking up gaps in fundraising. And if you had told me this is it's 11 years ago, it's the same time frame at UVA. This is part of what drives this is in Virginia, the General Assembly, they don't apologize. They issue a statement of profound regret for slavery. And I don't know if Wayne and Mary did the same at UVA. The Board of Visitors follows suit. And then we put in a plaque, and I wish I had an image. It's my favorite. It's a loathsome plaque in so many ways, but it's really amazing because it's this plaque that's why I'm sitting here today. They decide they have to do something about it. Well, when you're really scared about talking about slavery, where do you put a plaque? In the ground, right? They bury it in the ground. It is a threshold to an underground walkway, not making this up. And you can send students to find it, and they'll be standing at it, calling you, going, I don't know where it is. Look down. Yep. And it thanks the enslaved and free laborers who helped build the university from 1817 to 1826. So, right, in neglecting another 40 years of history and thousands of people. And then goes, thus realizing Thomas Jefferson's vision for the university. Remember, cult, not a college, navel gazing. So, and I laugh, right? That's the fear. How do we turn this into, it's the first halting moment of acknowledgement, but that's the plaque that got students and alumni upset, and they went about thinking about how can we fund projects that start to change the narrative, and that pushed the president to create the commission, and then the commission worked as a group on multiple fronts. And we're at a point now where we have a second commission that's actually funded for 4 years. So it takes a long time. You're going to give up a lot of your life for this.
I'll be brief. I know there were some hands up. We have not really faced a backlash. We have to navigate a lot of different constituencies. Students, faculty, alumni, the board, the descendant community, the Catholic Church. So the way I perceive it is not so much a backlash. I think there is broad support. There is fear and anxiety. By the way, in my conversations with descendant leaders, quite often we're sharing our own anxieties with each other. The descendant community has anxieties about how the work will proceed, how will it be perceived. So I don't see it so much as a backlash as realizing you're having to navigate a lot of different constituencies. And as in my role as vice president, I mean, I deal with a lot of issues on Georgetown. Slavery is one of them. One thing I will say is that, more than any other issue I deal with, whether it's, intercollegiate athletics, affordability and accessibility of higher education, you name it, on any given day. There is no issue that has as many people who become invested in it, who are, Kurt mentioned people are watching. People are watching, people are observing, and people have strong feelings, as they should, about this work. And I think that, again, that's not a backlash, but that also creates something that has to be navigated as you move forward.
Okay. Dr. Tougaloo.
I was really struck by Professor Brown's earlier comments on the narrative. And it seems to me to be the key term. It's about how you tell a story, right? And how you disrupt and interrupt other stories. It's about American exceptionalism or about the university's exceptionalism. Whether it's UVA, George Mason, where I teach, Georgetown, whatnot. And I think that one of the things that one of the other words that we don't like to deal with when we are talking about curricular concerns in this era really of liberal capitalism is marketing. How do we market certain courses to certain departments at universities to get them interested in what it is that we're attempting to try to accomplish here? How do we say to business school, for instance, there's this whole history about slavery and capitalism, you've got historians who've written on it, can we give a mini-course in that regard? Can we create a mandate that itself is strategic in teaching business majors at the beginning? How do we market ourselves to begin to change the narrative? I think that in some senses we have to begin to think about marketing and telling stories together.
Yeah. Well, I would just say, and it's funny you mentioned business school, because our business school has been one of the most active in terms of our prisons and justice initiative. How are we going to work with returning citizens to help them rebuild when they come out of prison? Some of the people we're working with, they've been in prison for 20, 30 years. And made terrible mistakes earlier in life. But the business school has stepped up. But part of it is it's transformation. So a lot of the language we use is there's healing, there's acknowledgement, but there's apology, then you have to create the space for healing, but you have to ultimately be in the pursuit of transformation. Transforming the narrative, transforming how we understand ourselves, so that this is not a footnote to the history. This is the history. The National Museum on the Mall is not a footnote. It is the history. It should have been the first museum on the mall, but it wasn't. But it is the history. And it's just very, very challenging for people to deal with that. But ultimately, it has to be, I think it has to be about transformation of the institutions itself. How do we look at ourselves? How do we define ourselves? And a full embrace of what this means and what this history really means for our institutions and ultimately for our country. But that's part of it. That's part of it. So I think the narrative is important, and you do disrupt narratives. When you disrupt established power narratives, and the people who have articulated those narratives don't like that, and so they will push back.
You guys want to respond to that one, Joe, or Jody, or?
Is there other hands going?
Yeah, there are 3 other hands we're going to get to. We're going to get back to repair.
Just one quick comment.
Sure.
And I don't know if this fully gets at the marketing idea, but I think some of this is incentivizing faculty to learn about this. So we have a program, Teaching Race Initiative, out of our provost's office that's meant to connect faculty to the community and help them develop components in their courses to talk about this, or develop new courses. And this is built on the program Leslie Harris built at Emory years ago. So I think there are a couple models to begin to think about how you spread this beyond your own office and your own classes.
3 quick questions. John, in the back, up there, get back. Yeah. No, John, later, get back.
I have a question for Dr. Ferrero. You said that y'all thinking about repair for the descendants. And I want to know, do y'all have a time frame for that? Because no disrespect, but it's been 180 years since those slaves, those 272 slaves were sold to plantations in Louisiana. And I have another question. You said...
Let's take that one first.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we are working very closely with the descendants in this dialogue process. The descendant community is very complex, where there are organized groups. One of the largest is called the GU 272 Descendants Association. It's only one of several. And there are also descendants who are not affiliated with any particular group, but whose voices must also be heard. So developing a dialogue process in that complexity will take some time, but we're working every step of the way with the leadership of the descendant groups, as well as with independent descendants who aren't affiliated with a particular group. I hear your point on time, and there is a sense of urgency that we have. We started this work 3 years ago, and I feel like we've made some progress. We have a long way to go. I think the fact that we're in dialogue with the descendant community is going to help move things along at a better rate than if we were somehow not talking to each other actively. So that's how I would answer that. But we're trying to move as quickly as we possibly can, but realizing that there's a lot of complexity and making sure we're engaging the whole, the total of the descendant community in this process.
John?
Yeah, I guess my question is the same line as the question was asked and the one about the marketing. It's, for me, if you look off campus, it's a realization timeline. Because once it's announced that there's an issue, that there's a discussion, and that we're going to try to do a repair for the discussion, then if it takes longer than my lifetime, and it's not relevant because they have to get it. The second point is, it goes from a national marketing or hesitant to people come in and say, okay, you said it, you're going to work on it, but now you're nothing, and all of a sudden another thing. So I guess it's more the marketing aspect as to how it relates to my generation, some generation, or
Any response to that, Jim? You want to respond to that?
I hear you. I think part of the complexity.
The work that I feel we have to do as institutions is get those materials out of our libraries, into the light, and up to the cloud. And so I'm just wondering what you all think about kind of the need to bring this information into the digital age so that people can find their families.
Let's answer that question in the context of how do you see the repair initiative going forward collectively, and what would you like to see? Obviously, you want, I would say obviously, but I think you would want to see records digitized so that the world see it. But Kurt, why don't you start off? What would you like to see as a system?
Are we going to be here for another week? That's a lot.
So to Jeff's question, I mean, yeah, we need to be digitizing all these. And it's not just digitizing. Like, what's a photograph of a 19th century document? It's yet one more thing that's hard to read. Yeah. So there needs to be transcription. And I think this is where, again, resource-rich institutions should be doing this. It might be your library team. At UVA, we have a whole digital project that's digitizing all the university records through 1870 and connecting them in a relational database. Jeff and I are in conversations with a much larger project trying to link all of these because we have lots of little local data that we can't always connect all the dots, and we know that our stories intersect. And I think there's an opportunity here to, what if universities work together to digitize all these documents, make them publicly accessible, build a database that lets you connect across institutions, and then allow that to be crowdsourced by people in communities all across the country. And we know, and I've been speaking from our local context, we have all these great community groups that have taught us a lot about our own history, material that lies outside of the university that comes from a cemetery restoration project that loops back to us. They don't have the resources to digitize records. They don't have the resources to put anything up on a website. And that's another place where maybe we can come back and help out. I don't know if that fully gets to the repair conversation, but it's moving in the right direction if we're all collectively working on making that material a lot more accessible to everyone.
What's your vision of repair, Joey?
Okay, that's different than Jeff's question.
I know. Kurt answered Jeff's question, but if you want to read on Jeff's question, go right ahead.
But I mean, certainly, the more documents that we can get digitized, again, the easier, the more likely it will be to find the connections between these campuses, because there are a lot. The William Barton Rogers, who's a founding president of MIT, went to William & Mary and taught at William & Mary. And he was on the faculty at UVA. So, there's all kinds of, but you don't necessarily know that, until somebody happens to mention it and you go, digging through stuff. We also probably need to get them to start teaching cursive again in schools, but that's another thing. But it is important, so that we can all work together and get this information out there. I know the special collections at William & Mary, there's a digital librarian. I don't know, that's not the official title, but there is someone that's their job, is to start getting this out. John, can you repeat?
Yeah, give us some of your vision for systemic repair.
Okay. Okay. Well, I guess, again, the key part is to make sure, I go back to my first, is to make sure your house is in order, first. Is that if you're looking at systemic, looking at changing the system, looking at changing the narrative, then that's going to be key. I think also in terms of just looking at systemic repair is educating ourselves about schools other than our own, different size schools, private, public, HBCUs, what have you, and learning to understand what we all have to offer each other and value that, really, truly value that about each other. Also, just our institutions have to make real financial commitment to this. A lot of us, at least when we started, we were doing this on shoestring budgets, volunteers and, but one of the things that the community is looking at is whether or not these institutions are putting real money behind what they're saying. They're saying these things and they're using words like inclusivity and diversity, but you have, a $20,000 budget for an entire year and you're supposed to make magic with that. So, the schools have to really commit in all ways, in resources and staff and in funding. So I'll stop there.
Okay.
I would agree with everything Jody just said, and I think also for us, systemic repair is bound up in these conversations and dialogue with the descendant community. So there has to be some mutual sense of transformation and of the direction of racial justice. In other words, Georgetown or the Catholic Church doesn't sit down and decide and then come out and proclaim, or you define prayer. That doesn't work. That won't work. It has to be a process of engagement together, creating the space for racial healing and transformation. And it's a process of building that foundation every day. But it literally is every day that you have to be working at this. But I think it's also the commitment on behalf of the institutions. And the good news I think at Georgetown is we have that. We're going to continue to have to generate and build that as we go forward. Because in many cases, this kind of work, there's some projects you work on and it's like really hard and then it starts to get easier. This work just gets harder. It doesn't get easier. There isn't an easy phase of it. It's just hard and then harder and harder. And I think we recognize that talking about the fear and anxiety that will generate in some constituencies, the exhaustion that it will generate in some constituencies. That's a factor that has to be built into this sort of roadmap for systemic repair as well.
Okay. Yeah, a second question back there.
Yes, the second question was also for Dr. Ferrero.
Joe, she just likes you.